Hi everybody, welcome to Articulating. I'm your host Wendy Adler. What is the one art that everybody has in their home? Think about that for a moment. Almost universally, everybody will have photographs of some type in their home. And so I thought it would be appropriate to talk about photography, and is it or is it not considered to be a fine art? These days, of course, we would consider it a fine art, although there are still some people that may think otherwise. And definitely when photography started to come into public use on a more prevalent level, a lot of people did not think it was a fine art form at all. But let's talk about the evolution of photography and how did we get to this point, okay? So the question today is, what makes photography an art? So photography, the definition of photography would be the method of recording an image of an object through the action of light on a light-sensitive material. And the word comes from the Greek photos, which meant light, and graphene, which meant draw. So photograph, drawing with light, okay? And in 1727, a German professor proves that the darkening of silver salts was caused by light and not by heat. So this basically was the beginning of how to use photography and a photographic process. He did not attempt to preserve the images, though, once he made this discovery. He was making it in association with the camera obscura. And the camera obscura, which I'm not going to try to explain to you, but suffice it to say, the camera obscura was something that goes back thousands of years, literally about 2,000 years. And that's the basic technology of photography, and that was the first form of any type of camera that was ever used. You might recall we talked about the Jan Vermeer used the camera obscura as a tool in constructing his pieces. So 1727, the German professor comes up with the fact that the silver salts are darkened by light and not heat. Fast forward about 100 years later, and in 1825, 1826, a camera obscura is used to make an 8-hour exposure by Joseph Nicephore Niepce. And this is called a heliography, or a sun drawing. So he actually sets up a camera and photographs out the window of his apartment into the courtyard. And with an 8-hour exposure, we have the world's first photograph. Then Louis Daguerre partners up with Niepce, and they start to examine what kind of things can they enhance through this technology. How can they develop this technology into something that might be more useful? So Daguerre partners with him in 1829, and they work on the reduction of the exposure times. Because 8 hours, nobody wants to sit around and wait for an 8-hour exposure, right? So in 1839, Louis Daguerre names the process and development technique that he and Niepce have come up with as a daguerreotype. And we've heard that term before. Daguerreotype allow for the first commercially used photographic process, okay? And in 1839, a British scientist, Henry Fox Talbot, reports that by using light-sensitive paper for that process, you can get even better development. That's actually called a calotype. So we have all these words that you may have heard in passing, or if you're a photography person as your hobby, I'm sure you've come across these terms before. But so far we have a heliography, we have calotype, and now we have a daguerreotype. We have all these different types, right? The first color photograph comes out in 1861, but we don't really use that in a common way until the mid-1960s, so 100 years later before we can actually use color photographs. And what they would have done up until that point, I'm sure you've seen hand-tinted photographs, mostly used in portraiture, right? So in the last decades of the 19th century, the photograph begins to replace painting as the modern form of portraiture. People begin to think, well, why do we need to have a portrait commissioned? Why do we have to put somebody through sitting still and letting an artist interpret how my loved one is going to look when we can have an actual photograph made instead? Now, having those photographs made would have been very uncomfortable because you would have had to sit very straight. Your head would have been put into some sort of rack or brace to keep you still. Your hands would have had to clutch onto the side, the armrests of your chair so that you didn't move. And you would have had to stay very, very still, or else you'd have blurriness. We're going to address the blurriness later because the blurriness actually gives rise to Impressionism. Anyway, we're jumping ahead. Don't want to jump ahead. So we have daguerreotypes, which are being used for portraiture, and those are taking the place of painted portraits in a very slow process. But those are very prevalent starting in about 1840 on forward. So when you have all those pictures of your ancestors sitting in a box upstairs in your attic, a lot of those would be daguerreotypes, and they would go back over 100 years. Okay, so photography comes along, and these artists in the late 19th century are saying, uh-oh, we better come up with something different. They're taking away our livelihood. They've taken away portraiture as a way for us to make money because people would rather have an actual photograph. So what are we going to do? So this gives rise to the Society of Rebels. We've talked about the Society of Rebels. Those were those impressionist artists that had been refused by the more traditional salon artists in Paris. And so they had to find their own way to exhibit because their art was so radical and different than what most artists had done up to this point. So some people think that perhaps the blurred photographs perhaps gave artists the idea of the Impressionist style, that kind of out-of-focus blurriness. Or perhaps photographs gave rise to the artists experimenting with the use of light, right? Because photography is all about light and using your light effectively. I'm not so sure how much truth actually comes from that, but I can definitely say that the rise in popularity from photography definitely pushed the artists into a new direction. And this all happened to feed into the time of Impressionism, which was, of course, the end of the 19th century. Okay? So we have here artists adopting the attitude that photographers' jobs would be to promote realism, since the photographer can capture what is actual, what is real. And that real artists would have to go beyond that. They would have to come up with a different approach to things. Artists could use bold color, and photographs were not able to do that yet. So the artists had to capitalize on the assets that were available to them. Right? Along with that, we've talked about the fact that Impressionism came about because now artists were no longer tethered to their studios. Oil paints now were portable. They came in small tubes just like they do today. And artists no longer had to be in their studio, mushing up the pigments with the pestle and the mortar and mixing it with their binder oils. Now they actually had oil paints that were already prepared in tubes and that were portable. So Impressionists were able to go out into the countryside and set up their easels and their materials and enjoy painting outside instead. So this also pushed the artists to take a new approach to things. So let's now talk a little more about why is photography an art form? Well, photography came about as an art form from advancements in the technology. This allowed photographers to manipulate their images. They could focus on light and the use of light and shadow and contrast. They could adjust the strength of the contrast. They could choose different cameras and different lenses and different types of film and different types of processing and how to frame their work and position their cameras. So they had a whole different medium available to them than what another artist might use. Then there was a whole movement called photo-secessionists. And the photo-secessionists moved away from customary photography, which was really just being used for portraiture or for journalistic activity. So these photo-secessionists were able to start using photography as an art form. They started to experiment just like all the other artists would do. So how do we describe or define fine art photography? Fine art photography describes any image taken by a camera where the intention is aesthetic as opposed to scientific. So photos with scientific value or photos with commercial value, like product placement, advertisements, or journalistic photos that may very well be artistic but were actually taken more in relation to a news article. Those would all be very different than what we would consider fine art photography. This leads us into what we've talked about in the past, the difference between fine art and craft, right? Fine art is something that is made specifically for aesthetics. It's made to hang on a wall and be enjoyed, or sit on a pedestal and be enjoyed. It's not made for any purpose. And that's essentially what fine art photography could be defined as. It's photography that was made without a particular purpose other than to just be enjoyed as art. Okay, so that's our basic definition of fine art photography. So there was a term that came about late 1800s, early 1900s, so we've moved into our century, the 20th century, the term pictorialism. And pictorialism refers to an international style, an aesthetic movement that flourished around the turn of the century. So right around late 1880s, 1890s, into about 1900, 1915 maybe. And that involved a lot of these new, well-known photographers using fine art photography and manipulating those images to create an artistic image, okay? So they might blur their focus, kind of like the Impressionists, right? So everybody was borrowing from everybody else's art techniques and periods. So there was blurring, and there was posing, and there was trying to catch people in motion. And so the photographers were really examining this technology and trying to push the boundaries, just like the artists were doing with Impressionism. So pictorialism starts to fade out a little bit after 1920, and it's being superseded by modernism. The public is starting to prefer photography to have a specific use. They're not really interested in the modern blurriness or the interpretations of the photographers. They want the photography to show them things that they hadn't seen before, but to do it in a realistic way. Whereas, of course, the artists now have gone completely off the deep end. They've moved into abstract expressionism, and they've moved into cubism, and they've moved into Dadaism and surrealism and all of these isms that people really were struggling to understand. So photography was easy for people to understand as long as the subject matter was understandable. So let's talk about some particular pioneers of photography and promoters of photography that really made a difference. The first two I want to address are Albert Stieglitz and Edward Steichen. And these were two very different gentlemen, both from New York. Alfred Stieglitz, we've spoken about before. He was best known for his relationship with Georgia O'Keeffe, and perhaps he was even best known for having taken 300 very provocative pictures of Georgia O'Keeffe, several of which had Miss O'Keeffe unclothed. So Alfred Stieglitz, born in 1864, dies in 1946, and Edward Steichen is born 1879, dies in 1973. So they both have long lives and were active throughout their whole lives as artists. Both of them were instrumental in helping to make photography a fine art. Stieglitz in particular, because Stieglitz owned a gallery. So in 1902, Stieglitz forms the Photo Secession movement, which is an association of creative photographers, and he publishes a magazine called Camera Work. And that magazine's purpose is to promote photography. So it's starting to build a following. Cameras are starting to become more readily available. People are starting to examine it as both a hobby and as something that they can do when they travel. It allows them to see things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to see in person. And so photography starts to become very much a hold on the public's perception of what's being seen around the world and around the country. It's also known as an avant-garde art form, kind of like Cubism and Surrealism and all those other isms I mentioned earlier. This is a new technology, and people have to learn to understand it, right? So the first photography exhibition, it's called the Buffalo Show, and this was in 1910 in Buffalo, New York, organized by Stieglitz. Okay, so by 1924, Stieglitz exhibitions and his writings in support of photography were beginning to have an impact, particularly in New York. New York had just begun to be seen as an art center. There were a lot of artists that had moved there during wartime or to escape the war. And so Stieglitz and his gallery were seen as a leader in the art world. In 1924, the Museum of Boston, Boston Museum of Fine Arts, acquires a collection of 27 of Stieglitz's photographs. This is a big deal. This is the first time a major American art museum had included photographs in its permanent collection. So Boston, hip hip hooray. So one of those photographs may have been this. This is one of Stieglitz's photographs of Georgia O'Keeffe. It doesn't really have a title. It's called Georgia O'Keeffe. And this one was done in 1920. And what are we looking at? Well, it's a very graceful photograph. It emphasizes various body parts, right? We can tell that she's unclothed, at least from the waist up. Her eyes are closed. Her hands are in a very graceful position. We have a very strong definition of line, which is brought into play by the contrast, another tool of photography. And she has kind of a neutral expression on her face, but we can kind of narrate our own story to this picture. I think this is a beautiful picture. I think the lines lead your eye around it nicely. I think her facial features are interesting. I'm sure that's what Stieglitz, or some of what Stieglitz found interesting about her. Of course, Stieglitz and O'Keeffe end up married later and lovers during this time. So these are very sensual photographs. There's kind of a little bit of that sensuality behind all of them, even when the pictures are just of her hands or of her waist. But here we have the beautiful shapes in this picture. The only issue with this, and with this series actually, was that Georgia O'Keeffe was wanting to be taken seriously as an artist. It was hard to take her seriously as an artist, particularly a female artist, when there were these nudie shots of her all over Stieglitz's gallery. So that ended up kind of haunting her throughout her career. Didn't hurt her in the end, but definitely when she was a young artist just starting out, these pictures were not considered to be very helpful to her. But Stieglitz was trying to promote a high quality of modern American art, including these fine art photographs. Another artist that Stieglitz helped promote is one that you're all very familiar with, I'm sure. Ansel Adams. So I don't know about you, I had pictures of Ansel Adams' beautiful Yosemite shots when I was first married, hanging in the walls of my apartment. Everybody seems to like Ansel Adams. His pictures are timeless, right? There's no human element. We have a lot of contrast. We have a lot of natural elements being shown in very dramatic ways. This particular one is called Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation there. I apologize. But Stieglitz staged one of Ansel Adams' first photography exhibitions in 1936. And in 1937, the Cleveland Museum of Art held the first major exhibition of Stieglitz's own photography. So Stieglitz was a pretty big deal. Ansel Adams was one of the artists that he promoted. We have this picture. This one was done in 1942. And then we have this picture, also an Ansel Adams picture. This one is called Mount Moran Grand Teton. This one was done in 1948. And just like the Canyon, Arizona picture, we have very vivid contrasts. We have a lot of sharp focus and studies of form and light. Ansel Adams wanted those images to convey a depth of emotion, even just using black and white film. Color film was not popular, but it was certainly available to professional photographers by the 1940s. But Ansel Adams chose to continue to do most of his oeuvre in black and white. In fact, very few color photographs from Ansel Adams. He and a partner, Fred Archer, developed the zone system. And the zone system was something that allowed to create the correct exposure of black and white film on paper. And so it was a system of making sure that that contrast was there that he was looking for. But these pictures are beautiful, and I think even 100 years from now, people will still respect and enjoy seeing Ansel Adams' work because of that timeless quality and because of nature being the subject, right? So let's talk a little more about Edward Steichen. Edward Steichen had been Stieglitz's partner in his 291 gallery. Steichen was a photographer for Vogue and for Vanity Fair. They were, of course, starting to use photography as a medium in magazine publications. And this was from 1923 to 1938. So he had quite an extensive career as a magazine photographer. He became the best known and highest paid photographer in the world at the time. And after the war, after World War II, he was appointed director of the Department of Photography for the somewhat new Museum of Modern Art in New York. Pretty big deal, right? And he stayed in that position until 1962. So he held the department chair for the photography at MoMA until 1962. In 1955, he curated a land-breaking exhibition called The Family of Man. This was an exhibition that toured from 1955 to 1962. It visited 91 different countries and was visited by over 9 million people. So this was a big deal. This was one of the first major photography exhibitions ever to be on tour throughout the world. And it was really a narrative about human life and shared experiences. There was some political edge to it. For example, it did have some photography of poverty in India, and it had some photographs from the war. But I think the object of The Family of Man was really to show how photography could host shared experiences by everybody from everywhere. So it was pretty well received, obviously, since it traveled so much. And the general message was that all people are similar in their joy, in their pain, and in their work. So that was Edward Steichen's contribution. Now we're going to move into Man Ray, whose name actually was Emanuel Radnitsky, and he was American. And Man Ray was known primarily as a surrealist artist. But what we're going to talk about is the fact that he was responsible for a technique called rayography, or rayograms, and it's named after him. So Man Ray establishes the technique of creating photographic prints without using a camera, but by using light-sensitive paper. So if you remember what we talked about early on, in 1727, we had the German professor who came up with the fact that things react to light and not heat. And Man Ray takes that same idea and he starts to make artworks called rayograms by making these light-sensitive paper photographs. So, I want to show you one. We did these when I was a kid in art class. I remember doing this, where you have like a blue piece of paper and it's kind of slimy, and you put objects on the paper and then you expose it to the sun, and then the shadow of the objects, or in fact the negative image, shows up as a shadow on the paper. So here we have a really interesting and very well-known Man Ray rayograph. And these images, his contribution to art, these rayographs may actually even be more important than his paintings. He was instrumental in leading photography into Dadaism and into Surrealism. And he was inspired by Stieglitz. He was also inspired by Marcel Duchamp, and we've talked a little bit about Marcel Duchamp. He's most famous for his urinal that was submitted into the Armory show as a piece of art. But Duchamp was a key figure in Surrealism. In other words, he wanted people to be able to think outside of the box. And I think that this photograph shows how a simple photogram can make somebody think outside of the box here. So this one is called Rayograph, and it's from 1926. Man Ray had moved to Paris at this point, and he stayed in Paris for about 20 years, although he is considered American, and he did end up back in New York. And it's the image itself that is producing the white in this picture. Can you guess what the image is of? To me, it looks like rope, but I think it was actually a ball of wire, if I'm not mistaken. And he had positioned it in a very interesting way in this picture. He had photographed everyday objects before, but these unique images and the way that we saw these images actually labeled Man Ray as avant-garde, or very forward-thinking. And it was kind of between abstract and representational, right? Depending on how you look at this picture, you could definitely say this is an abstract work. Or if you're more apt to look for realism, you could definitely put together an idea of what this image is of, right? We said it's either rope or wire. So you could approach this in a couple of different ways, and I think that was kind of the whole point of these rayograms. He wasn't telling us what they were in his title. He just basically called it rayogram, but it allowed us to see it in whatever way we wanted to see it. Okay? I'm going to show you one last work here. And I love this. This is one of my favorite artists and one of my favorite works of his. This is called Leap into the Void. And this is an artist, Yves Klein, who we've talked about in the past. Yves Klein was French. Sadly, he died at a relatively young age, so he's known mostly for his Yves Klein blue. And several sculptures and paintings that he did using a specific shade of blue. But Yves Klein was a rebel, and he was extremely avant-garde. And he made this photograph, Leap into the Void, which actually is titled Man in Space. The painter of space throws himself into the void. Now, why do I consider this to be an important work in photography? Well, to me, this is one of the first examples of Photoshop or photo trickery. When this picture was published, and it was first published in a Parisian newspaper, people were horrified. Why was this man throwing himself off of a building and he was going to land on the ground and he was going to kill himself? But in fact, he didn't. He actually took this picture with 3 of his friends standing below on the street holding a sheet to catch him in. And then he took the exact same picture and put it over a picture of the empty street scene. So he layered the picture of him jumping off into the trampoline over the exact same scene without anybody in it. How do we know this? We know this because later, after he was forced to admit that this had been trick photography, we saw the 2 pictures side by side, the one of him leaping off into the trampoline and the one of just the street empty. So this was the first trick photography, so early Photoshop, if you want to call it that. That's all I want to talk about when it comes to how photography became a fine art form. But let's talk again real quick just to sum up. Why was photography important in the art canon? Well, it reinvigorates older art forms. It forced artists to kind of look in new directions of what could they do now instead of just painting people. It required new portrait approaches, right? If we think about Picasso's portraits of women, or even portraits that are painted today, oftentimes they're a little more fantasy, not quite as realistic, because we don't need them to be, because we have photography. And it also became a hobby. It allowed people to examine ways of making art themselves. And why do we consider photography to be art? Well, it's a creativity. There's a creativity in the production process. There's also a creativity in the staging process. So it definitely requires a creative mind. It requires lots of different tools. We have lenses and filters and things all needed. What kind of decisions does the artist make? We talk about that a lot. In this case, of course, the artist or the photographer has to make decisions about lighting and about contrast, about shadow, about framing and positioning, about the kind of paper that they use, about the kind of exposure they're going to use. So there's lots of decisions that a photography artist has to make. And then, of course, the vantage point. Where is the photographer? What kind of message is the photographer trying to give us? So I think I've given you enough evidence that photography could definitely be considered a fine art form. I hope that I'm given the opportunity to take you on a tour of a gallery and a museum sometime soon, and we can examine this premise up close and personal. Take care. I hope to see you again soon.